My mother died when I was 3, and she filled a void in my life. And we got woke up to that loud, seemed like just loud, door knock. And I heard my granny give that treacherous scream that comes from a mom.
The window of the driver's seat was down. They also see a woman slumped over. There's blood near her head.
She was sitting in the car with her head resting on a pillow, as if she was making herself comfortable.
He was very flashy, very talkative, over the top.
She realizes, oh boy, what have I got myself involved with? Who is this man?
He has killed before, and he can kill again.
She said, I want to tell you about one other crime, and this one involves 4 murders.
That's a bloodbath.
He thought that this was a good payback.
The small, quiet community of LaHabra sits half an hour southwest of Los Angeles.
It's 7.1 square miles. It has industrial areas, commercial areas, and residential areas. It's basically a family community, and it has every single food restaurant you can imagine. People grow up in LaHabra and they stay in LaHabra.
Around 5:45 a.m. on Wednesday, November 12, 2003, a group of workers report for a job at Morgan Metals, located in a LaHabra industrial park.
They saw a car backed in. There wasn't a car that they recognized as belonging to one of their employees, so that seemed out of the ordinary to the workers.
The window of the driver's seat was down. They also see a woman slumped over. But the craziest thing was there's blood near her head and she's on a pillow, and the car is still running.
One of the managers walks over to have a look at this car. He looks and sees this woman in the front seat and sees blood, and immediately determines that this person appears to be dead, and he's the one that calls the police. And the EMTs came and checked her and determined that she was in fact deceased.
And that's when they saw at least 1 gunshot wound.
The first question that comes up is, was this a suicide? She's in the vehicle by herself, but there was no gun located, which made it unusual to assume that this was a suicide since there was no gun.
So by the time the police got there, they knew they were dealing with a homicide and a gunshot wound victim.
They needed to identify her, so they saw that she had a purse. Inside that purse was still her wallet, and in the wallet they found her ID. It said that she was 22-year-old Anika Edmondson of Compton, California. There are so many questions here because not only is this an industrialized area, but it's really an isolated area, and it's kind of the perfect place to dump a body. The possibilities were endless. They just didn't know.
Anika Edmondson was born on June 6, 1981. She was raised in Compton, California, by her mother and a tight-knit extended family.
Anika, AKA Nika is what we all refer to her as, was a daughter of 4. The youngest, the baby girl. Going down the line, there was another sibling after her, so she finally became a big sister. Growing up, she was literally the light of the house, the boss maker, as I've been told anyways. Definitely courageous and just a ball of energy.
As a teenager, Anika landed in hot water.
She had some troubles with some girls, and they told her, we're gonna be waiting for you after work on a particular day. Anika had carried some razors in her hand, some box cutters, so to say. And when the girls came for her, she was ready to, defend herself. And she ended up slicing one of the girls' face. And when it went to the court system, they ended up taking her away for about 4 years. But in hindsight, everything happens for a reason. That's when she really, I think, made some hard decisions in there. How I'm gonna change my life, how I'm gonna, go about the rest of this, how I'm gonna make this better. She even wrote in some of her journals, how much she missed us, but she knew this was not gonna define her. And she did such.
She went to the California Youth Authority afterwards, and then began to rehabilitate herself and began to work. She wanted a better life for herself.
She was a great student. She went on after high school to do CNA. Her dream was to become a nurse eventually. We were so proud of her because of her, her trials that she went through at a very young age.
When she wasn't working or spending time with her family, Inika pursued her favorite hobby.
One of her biggest passions was cars. She was involved in a pretty cool car club. And in that club, what she really enjoyed doing on her pastimes was road trips and car shows.
Car culture is timeless in LA. It's been around since the 50s or 60s. And each car club is different. The kind of cars you're driving are different. The members of the club are different. A lot of people belong to it, and Inika was like that.
She really, really, really loved that car club. She was getting clothes airbrushed, jackets airbrushed. She took it to a whole nother level. She had a Toyota Corolla. She got it painted. She put TVs in there. She put rims on it. And she took it to the next level.
But on November 12, 2003, Inika lies dead inside her treasured Corolla with at least one gunshot wound to the head. LaHabra detectives arrive on the scene.
They were checking this vehicle for clues, and keep in mind that a vehicle is a very small closed area, so it's fairly easy to contain the crime scene. They don't find anything in the car forensically that tells them who the suspect is.
Unable to determine who killed Inika, investigators focus on why.
Police are looking for a motive. Why this young lady is in the middle of an industrialized parking lot.
This was not a robbery gone bad because the victim's cell phone or belongings were there, her jewelry was there. I believe she had rings and watches. Her pockets were not turned out. The car was not in disarray.
They saw that she was completely clothed. Her clothes was intact.
She clearly had not been sexually assaulted. That was clear from the scenario. So it eliminated some of the more common motives for the murder of a female.
It doesn't look like she struggled. It doesn't look like she threw anything. It doesn't look like the crime scene was chaotic.
In fact, it's the opposite.
Her car was backed into a parking stall, a very comfortable way to park the car. She was sitting in the car with her head resting on a pillow, as if she was making herself comfortable.
She seemed to be at rest and at peace. She never saw this coming.
None of it made sense. So why was she there? And why was she killed there?
After finding few clues at the crime scene, investigators released 21-year-old Inika Edmondson's body to the medical examiner for autopsy. Detectives head to the address listed on Inika's driver's license.
And that early morning, we got woke up to that loud, seemed like just loud. door knock. And I laid in her bed and I heard my granny give that treacherous scream. That scream that comes from a mom.
They asked for a list of anyone who her family knew that was close friends with her. They found out there that she was involved with a car club. And they also found out that she had been dating a gentleman by the name of Cimarron Bell.
He was very flashy, very talkative, over the top. He liked dressing nice. He really enjoyed showing off his nice things.
Simi funded his expensive tastes with profits from a cleaning company he owned and operated.
With his janitorial business, he would go into these businesses after hours and clean the business.
But Ainika's mother tells them she wasn't impressed by Simi's flashy clothes and fancy cars.
You know, he would pick her up, he would not get out the car, he would stay across the street. Nobody ever met him. You know, again, he never showed his face.
Back at the station, investigators look at the cell phone collected from Ainika's vehicle.
One of the last phone calls that Ainika Edmondson made was to a person that they understood to be her boyfriend. And that was to Cimarron Bell, known to his friends as Simi.
Investigators want to talk to Simi. But first, they attend Ainika's autopsy the following morning.
Ainika was shot not once, not twice, but 3 times, close range, in the head with a .38 caliber gun.
She was relaxing with her pillow and didn't appear to be holding on to the door or making any attempt to cover her face. It became evident that Miss Edmondson knew the person that had shot her in the head. So the detectives called in several of Miss Edmondson's friends, and they contacted Mr. Bell on the phone and asked him if he would be willing to come into the police station in order for him to be interviewed.
He's escorted back to an interview room to talk to the detectives.
He did mention during the interview that Miss Edmondson is someone who he had dated. He made it sound somewhat casual. The detectives told him that they had looked at Miss Edmondson's phone and that her last call had been to him. He said he spoke to her briefly and that he hadn't seen her since the previous weekend.
He says, "I'm really sorry, she's dead. I plan on going to her funeral. I have no idea who did this to her."
When detectives escort Simi to the lobby, they see he hadn't come alone.
Detectives took note of a woman there waiting for him.
As the first detective finished speaking to Mr. Bell and giving him his business card, the other detective asked the female if she would be willing to step outside in front of the police department so he could speak to her for a couple of minutes. So she agreed. She stepped outside, at which time she told the detective outside that her name was Nissa Wyatt. She claimed to be just a friend who had driven Mr. Bell to the police station.
As for Ainika, Nissa says she barely knew her.
She says, well, I didn't really know her. I only knew her through Simi, and she knows them both through the car club.
Nissa has little to offer. But detectives notice that Simi is suddenly on edge.
The detective who was in the lobby with Mr. Bell noticed that as soon as Miss Wyatt stepped outside, Mr. Bell got extremely nervous. His attention was diverted from the detective. He was focusing outside.
At the time, we thought, okay, he might not necessarily be a suspect, but maybe we need to talk to him later on and continue to involve this investigation to see what we can find. But for now, we're going to let him go. That's exactly what they did.
Just a few days after Ainika's death, investigators have no leads.
By the time it turned to January of the next year, the case was going nowhere, other than we have a dead young woman in our city.
The very beginning of February, that's when there's a big and very unexpected break in the case that no one was looking for.
3 months after Ainika Edmondson's mysterious murder, police actually end up arresting Nisa Wyatt on bank fraud charges. And instead of talking about her crime, she tells police, I want to tell you about one other crime. And this one involves 4 murders.
Three months after Ainika Edmondson is shot to death in a LaHabra parking lot, 25-year-old Nisa Wyatt is arrested on fraud charges.
Nisa Wyatt got arrested by the feds for what was really some pretty ticky-tacky credit card fraud that she got involved in at her workplace.
Nisa, she was working for a big box store. She was allowing people that she knew to come in with fraudulent credit cards to buy merchandise this way or return merchandise that way. She would get a kickback from them.
But Nisa wants to talk about something more serious.
The information that she had to offer involved the death of 4 different people. And Ms. Wyatt said that she had specific details about these homicides that she was willing to share about a person she was dating. And she didn't ask for any special favors. She did not ask for her case to be dismissed. She told the detectives she was very scared of him.
In return, she wants protection for her family. And when she reveals the name, it's a name police have heard before, Cimarron Bell.
Nisa says that she lied when she told police back in November that she and Simi were just friends.
Miss Wyatt said that Mr. Bell was married, but also had a couple of girlfriends, and that both Ainika and Miss Wyatt were his girlfriends.
But according to Nisa, Simi and Ainika also had a business relationship.
With his janitorial business, he would go into these businesses after hours and clean the business, but he wasn't just cleaning them, he was cleaning them out of checks.
He had Ainika open a joint bank account with him and herself in the name of a business, and then deposit the checks through that account, wait for the check to clear, and then take the money out before the bank has an opportunity to find out that it's a stolen check.
But one day, it went wrong. One of the cashier's checks that he had given to one of his business associates was reported stolen. And the first thing that came to mind was that Miss Edmondson must have turned on him so that she would be the only person able to retrieve money from that account. And that made him angry.
Nisa says Simi also believed Ainika was spreading rumors about their relationship.
She was telling people that she and Mr. Bell were going to become exclusive and that he had shopped for a ring. And that upset him because he said that wasn't true.
According to Nisa, Simi told her he was going to get Ainika out of his life permanently.
He needed to kill her in his view because this information was in the street and it might get back to his wife.
Nisa says she asked Simi to give Ainika a second chance.
Miss Wyatt had asked Mr. Bell to give her some time so that she herself could confront Miss Edmondson.
She told him, just let me talk to her first.
But on the night of November 12th, Nisa realized she wouldn't get the chance.
Mr. Bell called Nisa to his home. And she came there, and he was in all black.
He seemed very agitated and annoyed, and he was pacing back and forth, and this was not like him at all. And when Nisa asked him, what's wrong? He said, I did it. I killed her. And she said, killed who? He said, I killed Ainika.
And she did not believe him. And he said, I have to show you something.
According to Nisa, they hopped in her car and he directed her to the parking lot of Morgan Metals in LaHabra.
And he says, look. And so Nisa looks beyond him to her right and sees what she recognizes being Anika's car there. And it's back into a stall. There's a sticker on Anika's car, which Nisa recognizes as belonging to her. And then she realizes that Mr. Bell's telling her the truth.
Simi told Nisa he'd asked Ainika to meet him there so they could go to a hotel. She was waiting for him when he arrived.
She is not suspecting trouble, right? She's backed into a parking space. She's got her pillow out to rest. She's got music playing. Her cell phone's in her lap. She's comfy cozy.
He walked up the car and he told her, I have to get my cell phone in the car. I've left it behind. I need to have that before we go off together. And he kissed her.
He walked to his car, he put some gloves on, came back with a revolver, and shot and killed Miss Edmondson.
He was bragging. He was laughing about how Ainika's body jumped when he shot her in the head. And laughing about it.
She realizes, oh boy, what have I got myself involved with? Who is this man? I wouldn't think he was capable of that, but apparently he is.
He killed Ainika because he was afraid that Ainika was going to be providing too much information about him. He doesn't like it when people provide too much information about him, and now Nisa has too much information about him. So she's pretty realistic in thinking that she has reason to fear him.
For the next 3 months, Nisa stayed in the relationship out of fear, unaware of what lay ahead.
Ainika Edmondson's murder was just the first murder. Nisa had no idea that there would be more to come.
In February 2004, Nisa Wyatt tells LaHabra detectives that her boyfriend, Simi Bell, confessed to killing his other girlfriend, Ainika Edmondson.
At this point, she's in fear for her life because she knows if Simi killed Ainika, then she could be next.
Nisa tells investigators that about a month ago, Simi started feeling the loss of the fraud scheme he and Ainika had been running together.
He can't meet his expenses, his bills. Car payments, all the cars he has. The money's dried up. He needs more.
And he had come up with a scheme with his good friend, Mr. Brielle Lee. And they had decided that they were going to advertise Mr. Bell's Monte Carlo for sale at an incredibly low price.
He decided to list his Monte Carlo in Auto Finder. And instead of listing it for the $23,000 that it was worth, he only listed it for roughly like $8,500.
Not long after listing the ad, Simi asked Nisa to join a phone call to set up a meeting with potential buyer, Mario Larios.
Mr. Bell involved Nisa because he had trouble understanding what Mario was saying.
He thought Mario was saying, "I'm coming in a white van." And he had to have Nisa listen, and Nisa told him, "No, white Benz. He's coming in a white Benz."
Later on, she sees on the news that a white Mercedes-Benz was found in a commercialized area with 3 bodies in the car. Her mouth dropped, and that's when she knew that Simi was involved.
Investigators are familiar with the case. On January 30th, 24-year-old Mario Larios was found dead, along with his cousin, 26-year-old Fernando Pina, and a friend, 23-year-old Edgar Valle. All 3 men were inside the Mercedes parked behind a La Miranda strip mall.
The white Mercedes-Benz has blood all in the back seat, as well as 2 bodies wrapped up in plastic. In the trunk is a 3rd body, no plastic at all. And when they do the autopsy report, 2 of the men were shot with a .38 caliber gun, and the other man, a .357.
Nisa confronted Simi about what she'd seen on the news.
And that's when he confessed, and he says that he initially invited them to a gas station. He says, "Follow me back to the house and we'll do our deal there." They follow him back to the house, and that's when he and a friend were waiting.
Mr. Brielle Lee was an accomplice of Mr. Bell and had been enlisted by him.
Brielle waited at the house for the men to arrive.
And the minute they get inside that house, Mr. Bell starts shooting. Mr. Lee is also lying in wait inside that house with the 2nd gun.
Simi fatally shot Edgar. His next shots left Fernando and Mario wounded.
Mr. Bell called out Mr. Lee from his hiding place at the back of the house to assist him in killing Mr. Pina, who was trying to run out of the house, having been shot and wounded, and to finish off Mr. Larios.
Mr. Lee was his willing sidekick. But when the moment came to do the shooting, it looks like Mr. Lee was not entirely sure of himself.
Simi ended up taking a gun, holding it to Brielle Lee's head, and said, "If you don't do it, I'm gonna shoot you." So this forced Brielle Lee to get involved and shoot.
Brielle fired the fatal shot at Mario, while Simi took out Fernando.
They take their wallets, take their cell phones, take everything of value, bracelets, watches, everything off their bodies, okay? They go through the wallets and see that it's only a certain amount of cash in Mr. Larios' wallet. It's about $3,000.
Brielle pulled the Mercedes into the garage.
They put one of them in the trunk, and they put 2 of them inside, wrapped in plastic, and then they drove the vehicle to an empty parking lot in the city of La Mirada, and they walked away from the vehicle.
Investigators release Nisa with the understanding that she must take precautions.
She had to get out of the city. Nisa and her family had to change their life, and they ended up leaving Compton and going to another location far away from Compton.
She definitely knows from what the things that he has discussed with her that he has killed before and he can kill again.
After questioning, LaHabra investigators release Nisa Wyatt, former associate of now quadruple murder suspect Simi Bell.
Not only has she tied together the murder of Miss Edmondson, but she has tied together the murder of 3 separate people in Los Angeles County that had also gone unsolved. And at this point, there's no reason for any detectives to believe that the murders in 2 different counties are related in any way. except for the fact that Nisa has important details about these homicides.
Detectives look into her claims about Bell's involvement in the murders of Mario Larios, Fernando Pina, and Edgar Valle.
When they do the autopsy report, 2 of the men were shot with a .38 caliber gun and the other man a .357. Police quickly realize this lines up with Nisa's story because she says that Simi told her he shot 2 of the guys. He had a .38 caliber gun. She also says that Brielle Lee shot 1 of the men. He had the .357. So this lines up with her story.
A check of Mario's cell phone records also backs up her story.
They checked the phone belonging to this victim, and they saw that the last number he had dialed was the phone number that belonged to Mr. Bell.
Something Mario and Inika have in common.
It seems too coincidental that you have separate murder victims who have cell phone numbers that show that the last person they called prior to their death was Mr. Bell.
On Friday, February 12, 2004, detectives obtain a search warrant for his home.
The search warrant allowed the detectives to bring a forensic crime lab in. They began looking for evidence anywhere in the house. It was a small, modest home, but the inside looked very nice. The walls were freshly painted. It appeared almost like a new home, maybe as if the walls had been plastered.
They begin to dig into the patchwork of the house and find bullets lodged in the house.
And then they're finding visible bullet holes in the walls in the kitchen. There is still a bullet sitting behind the dish drainer. The dishes in the dish drainer still sitting on the kitchen counter, just sitting there.
I searched the garage, and the .38 caliber handgun that was believed to have been used to murder Miss Edmondson was found. I searched one of the bedrooms, and I found contracts that showed a business relationship with Morgan Metals in LaHabra.
Morgan Metals, the very location where Inika was killed, which is why he chose it. He knew it was a place no one would see the murder occur.
And this is the same area that he told police he'd never visited.
Following the search, Simi is arrested.
They see his 2001 Monte Carlo and they pull him over, and that's when they search the car. They find the .357 gun.
Investigators believe they now have both murder weapons.
The Rome was found in the garage. The other one with the .357 was in the Monte Carlo.
Police took Mr. Bell to the police station. They began to tell him, you've been accused of 4 murders, one involving Inika Edmondson, the other involving 3 men, and the 3 men were killed in your house. And Mr. Bell stares ahead and puts his head in his hands and begins to cry. And says nothing after that. Nothing to say.
The following day, police pick up Simi's alleged accomplice in the triple homicide, Brielle Lee.
Mr. Lee is arrested, and he is taken out of the police station, and he is, I wouldn't call it forthcoming, but he's more verbal than Mr. Bell, and he begins to tell the police officers a series of lies.
Brielle just kept talking, and he kept changing his story. He changed his story a lot.
Both Simi and Brielle plead not guilty. As for Simi, prosecutors plan to seek the ultimate punishment.
A case of that magnitude, you're seeking the death penalty. We're talking about 4 murders.
It was very clear that if Mr. Bell didn't like somebody that was infringing on his lifestyle or threatened to expose him, Mr. Bell's plan was to get payback.
On Thursday, March 17, 2011, in California's Norwalk Superior Court, 36-year-old Simi Bell goes on trial for the murder of Inika Edmondson, Mario Larios, Fernando Pina, and Edgar Valle.
I was about 21 now. I was pregnant with my first child during this trial. My granny, she was never the same. We all showed up though, we were there every day. My dad, her brother, her sister-in-law, me, her dad, I believe, came. It was hard, hearing the details.
In his opening statement, prosecutors lay out Simi's motive in Inika's death.
You have his girlfriend who he was working with, and she was cool until he felt like she was in the way. He felt like she was taking money out of his pocket, and he felt like she needed to pay with her life.
According to the prosecutors, Simi's motive in the triple homicide was both greed and revenge.
He wanted to target buyers from a specific ethnicity because he felt that people from that culture had ripped off a lot of other people, so he thought that this was a good payback.
Cimarron Bell is a stone-cold psychopath. He had no intention of ever selling them. He was just going to kill them and take the money.
Prosecutors present overwhelming evidence.
The forensic examination of the firearms tied them both to Inika Edmondson's murder as to the Rome, and then the Rome was also used to kill the individuals in the triple murder, and the .357 was used to kill Mario Larios. There is DNA in this house, huge quantities of DNA that is absolutely 100% matched to the victims at mathematical exclusion rates that are astronomical.
Their star witness, Nisa Wyatt, takes the stand.
This was essentially a story of payback, but he didn't see another payback coming, and that was from his other girl, Nisa.
She was the backstory and motive, which was very interesting and very helpful for our understanding of why the crimes happened.
Simi's attorneys take aim at Nisa's testimony.
The defense attacks her credibility. They actually accuse prosecutors of making a deal with the devil.
They basically told the jury, you can't believe a word out of Nisa's mouth.
But the jury sees things differently.
It's Nisa's testimony that ultimately forces Simi to pay the price for Inika's death, and he's found guilty of not one, not two, but all 4 murders.
Mr. Bell was sentenced to death. That was the jury's recommendation, and the judge did impose a sentence of death.
I mean, nothing ever makes it feel better, but it was definitely a relief. A relief for us, a relief for, us as a family, knowing that he was finally put away. On that day particularly, I can say we all gained a small amount of peace.
At a separate trial, Simi's accomplice, Brielle Lee, is found guilty of the second-degree murder of Mario Larios. He's sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. The case comes to an end. But for Inika's family, the loss lingers.
Life was just too short for her. And if I could tell her one thing, it would simply be thank you. Thank you for being who I needed at that time. My mother died when I was 3, and she filled that void for me. She filled a void in my life that nobody could ever have filled. She encouraged me to keep going. She taught me some of my most precious life lessons that I hold on today as a 34-year-old married woman and mother of 3.
The first thing that arrived on February 1st, 2022, wasn't the police. And it wasn't the sound of sirens cutting through the quiet streets of Chelmsford in Essex, England. It was silence. The kind of heavy, unnatural silence that settles in a home after something irreversible has already happened, when time itself feels like it has hesitated for just a moment too long before continuing forward. Inside a modest residential building, behind a closed door that would later become the center of a murder investigation, a young life had already been extinguished in a way that defied easy comprehension. Her name was Ashley Wadsworth, 19 years old, from British Columbia, Canada, a girl who had crossed an ocean not for adventure, not for escape, but for love. And love, in this case, had become the final destination of a journey she could never return from. To understand how a story like this begins to unravel, you have to step backward before the violence, before the panic, before the moment everything broke apart, and into the fragile architecture of trust built between two people who first met not in person, but through screens, messages, and the strange intimacy of digital connection. Ashley met Jack Seppel when she was still a teenager, an age where emotions often feel infinite and certainty feels like something you can build your entire future on if you just believe hard enough. Their relationship grew across distance, time zones, and years of virtual communication, existing in a space where reality is partially imagined and partially filled in by hope. For Ashley, who was described by those who knew her as quiet, gentle, and reserved, this connection became something deeply personal, almost sacred in its consistency. While others her age were navigating the shifting uncertainties of adolescence, she was building a bond that felt stable, even if it existed primarily through messages and calls. Jack Seppel, older and physically distant in England, became a constant presence in her emotional world, a person who represented not just romance, but the idea of a future that was waiting on the other side of commitment. Over time, what began as digital companionship transformed into something far more serious, something that demanded real-world decisions. And so, in late 2021, Ashley made a choice that would define the final chapter of her life. She left Canada and flew across the Atlantic to begin living with him in Chelmsford, Essex. It was a decision shaped by belief, by emotional investment, and by the conviction that love, once proven over years of distance, could survive the transition into physical reality. But reality has a way of revealing details that screens never show. Once Ashley arrived in England, the dynamic between the two began to shift in ways that were not immediately visible to the outside world, but increasingly felt within the walls of their shared space. What had once been mediated through careful messages and curated interactions became immediate, physical, and unavoidable. Small disagreements no longer had the buffer of distance. Silence was no longer just absence of reply, but presence in the same room. According to later accounts and investigative findings, the relationship began to show signs of instability, jealousy that tightened its grip without warning, emotional volatility that turned ordinary conversations into tense exchanges, and moments where control replaced communication as the dominant language of the household. Ashley, far from home and separated from her support system, found herself in a position that many young people in unfamiliar relationships experience but rarely anticipate with clarity: the slow realization that the environment they have entered does not feel as safe as the one they left behind. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists when you are physically close to someone but emotionally isolated within the same space, when every decision about leaving feels heavier than staying, because leaving means confronting uncertainty alone in a foreign country. In those weeks leading up to February, something in Ashley shifted. Those who later pieced together her final days described a growing unease, an internal alarm that began to override the initial optimism she had carried with her from Canada. She reportedly expressed a desire to return home, to go back to the familiarity of British Columbia, to step away from a situation that no longer felt stable or safe. That desire, however, became a source of tension within the relationship. Jack Seppel, confronted with the possibility of losing control over the situation or the relationship itself, reacted in ways that escalated emotional pressure. Arguments became more frequent. Voices reportedly rose behind closed doors. The atmosphere inside the apartment grew increasingly strained, as though every conversation carried the weight of an unspoken countdown. Neighbors would later recall hearing shouting from within the residence, fragmented sounds of conflict that disrupted the normal rhythm of the building but were not, at the time, fully understood in their significance. In many domestic violence cases, the outside world often hears pieces but never the full picture, and what was happening behind that door was no exception. To those outside, it may have sounded like conflict. To Ashley, it was becoming something far more suffocating. Fear, once subtle, began to take shape as something more defined. The idea of leaving England and returning to Canada was no longer just a thought. It was becoming a plan, and plans in volatile relationships can sometimes act as catalysts for escalation. The gap between intention and reaction narrowed dangerously. In the final days before February 1st, the emotional temperature of the household had reached a critical point. There were indications of heightened tension, moments where Ashley's discomfort was no longer private but expressed outwardly, and moments where Jack's responses reportedly reflected an inability to regulate his emotional state when faced with the prospect of separation. It is in these fragile intersections of fear, dependency, and control that many domestic tragedies begin to form their final shape, not as sudden explosions, but as accumulations of unresolved pressure. On the night of the incident, inside the bedroom of that Chelmsford apartment, the situation reached its irreversible conclusion. What exactly was said in those final moments is known only through fragments of evidence and later investigative reconstruction, but what is clear is that the confrontation escalated into physical violence. Ashley was attacked in the space that should have been the most private and secure area of the home. The assault began with strangulation, an act that suggests proximity, control, and overwhelming physical dominance, before escalating into a sustained knife attack that would ultimately result in approximately 90 stab wounds. The brutality of the act was not just in its outcome, but in its duration, the sheer number of injuries reflecting a level of violence that forensic experts would later classify as extreme. Ashley died in that room, far from the country where she grew up, far from her family, and far from the future she had imagined when she boarded a flight believing she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. In the aftermath of the attack, the expected pattern of behavior in many such cases did not unfold. There was no immediate attempt to flee the scene, no prolonged effort to conceal evidence in the traditional sense of evasion. Instead, what followed was something deeply unsettling in its own way, a moment of apparent collapse. Jack Seppel recorded a video on his phone in which he acknowledged what had happened, with Ashley's body visible in the background, and expressed a form of emotional breakdown that would later be scrutinized by investigators and the court. In that video, he reportedly admitted to killing her and expressed remorse, while also indicating that he had contacted authorities himself. This behavior added another layer of complexity to the case, challenging simple narratives of calculated intent versus impulsive breakdown, and instead placing the focus on a volatile psychological state that had culminated in irreversible harm. When police arrived at the scene, they were confronted with the reality of the situation and immediately took Jack into custody. The weapon was recovered, the apartment secured, and the early stages of what would become a formal homicide investigation began to take shape. But long before the legal process would unfold, before courtrooms and sentencing, before public statements and media coverage, there remained the quieter, more devastating truth of what had been lost. A 19-year-old girl who had crossed continents in pursuit of love, only to find herself trapped in a situation that ended in violence she could not escape. The hook of this case is not only in its brutality, but in its familiarity, because beneath the specific details lies a broader pattern that repeats in different forms across different places: the vulnerability of emotional trust when it is built across distance, the difficulty of recognizing control when it is disguised as affection, and the moment when hope collides with reality in a way that cannot be undone. To understand how this case unfolded inside that small apartment in Chelmsford, you have to understand the environment it existed in, not just as a physical place, but as a psychological container where distance from home, emotional dependency, and private conflict all began to compress into something increasingly unstable. Chelmsford itself is not a city defined by violence or chaos. It is, in many ways, a typical English town in Essex, shaped by residential streets, modest housing blocks, local shops, and a quiet rhythm of daily life that rarely suggests the possibility of tragedy lurking behind closed doors. For most residents, life moves in predictable cycles: work, school runs, errands, conversations with neighbors that stay comfortably on the surface. It is precisely this normality that makes cases like Ashley Wadsworth's so unsettling, because nothing about the external environment signals what is happening internally within a specific household until it is already too late. The apartment where Ashley and Jack lived was part of this ordinary landscape, a place that would not stand out to anyone passing by. From the outside, it was simply another residence among many, a structure designed for temporary stability rather than permanence. Inside, however, the space quickly became the entire world for two young people attempting to define their relationship in physical form after years of digital connection. There is a psychological shift that occurs when an online relationship becomes cohabitation. The imagination, which once filled in gaps with idealized versions of a person, is forced to confront the full presence of another human being, complete with habits, moods, silences, and imperfections that cannot be filtered or edited. For Ashley, this transition meant moving from a relationship experience through distance into one experience through constant proximity, where emotional signals were no longer delayed by time zones or screens, but immediate and unavoidable. Before she arrived in England, Ashley's understanding of Jack had been shaped largely through long-term communication. Over the years, a sense of familiarity had developed, one built not on physical interaction but on sustained emotional exchange. This kind of connection can feel deeply intimate because it allows individuals to present themselves in ways that are carefully curated yet emotionally resonant. In that space, trust grows through consistency rather than physical experience. When Ashley boarded her flight from Canada, she was not entering the unknown in her mind. She was stepping into a version of familiarity that had already been emotionally rehearsed countless times. The expectation was not discovery, but continuation. Chelmsford, however, did not carry the emotional language of that digital past. It was a place defined by immediacy. Weather was not described through messages but felt through skin. Silence was not a pause in conversation, but a shared physical presence in a room. Daily life required negotiation of space, time, and emotional reactions in real time. In such conditions, relational dynamics often reveal themselves more clearly, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly. According to later understanding of the relationship, this period marked the beginning of visible strain between Ashley and Jack, though at the time it would not have been framed so explicitly by either of them in public terms. What emerged within the apartment was a pattern that has been documented in many cases of domestic escalation, emotional intensity that fluctuated between closeness and conflict. Moments of connection could be followed by sudden disagreements, not necessarily over singular dramatic events, but over accumulated tension that found expression in everyday interactions. When two people share a confined living space, even small disagreements can feel magnified because there is no true separation point where emotions can reset. The room itself becomes part of the conflict, absorbing every word, every silence, every gesture. For Ashley, the emotional geography of this space was complicated further by her physical separation from home. She had left behind not just a country, but a network of familiarity, family, friends, cultural comfort, and the subtle reassurance of knowing how to navigate everyday life without explanation. In Chelmsford, she was adapting not only to a relationship, but to an entire environment that was not her own. This kind of displacement can intensify emotional reliance on a partner, especially when that partner is also the primary point of social contact. In such conditions, the relationship can begin to carry an uneven weight, where one person becomes both companion and environment, both emotional support and source of conflict. Reports and later accounts suggested that within this period, tensions in the relationship became more pronounced. Jealousy and control, whether expressed directly or indirectly, began to shape interactions. These dynamics are often not immediately recognizable from the outside because they do not always appear as overt acts. Instead, they can manifest through tone, through restrictions on movement or communication, through emotional reactions that gradually influence behavior. Over time, these patterns can narrow a person's sense of autonomy without a single defining moment that clearly marks the shift. Ashley's growing discomfort, as later understood through investigative context, suggests that she began to reassess the situation she had entered. The idea of returning to Canada indicates a psychological turning point, where the initial expectation of stability gave way to a recognition that something within the relationship no longer felt secure. This is a critical stage in many domestic violence cases, not because leaving is always imminent, but because the internal realization of unsafety often precedes external action by a significant emotional margin. The decision to leave, especially when living abroad, is rarely simple. It involves financial considerations, logistical planning, emotional conflict, and often fear of how the other person will react. Within the apartment, this growing internal shift reportedly coincided with increased friction. Conversations that might once have been resolved easily began to escalate more quickly. Emotional responses intensified. The presence of disagreement itself became destabilizing. In relationships where emotional regulation is already fragile, the introduction of perceived abandonment or separation can act as a catalyst for escalation. The suggestion that Ashley might return to Canada was not simply a logistical statement. Within the emotional structure of the relationship, it represented loss, rejection, and loss of control all at once. Chelmsford itself continued its normal rhythm outside the apartment. People went to work, shops opened, weather changed in its typical English unpredictability. The contrast between external normality and internal instability is one of the most striking aspects of domestic cases like this. There is no visual marker in the surrounding environment that indicates the severity of what is unfolding inside a specific home. Neighbors may hear fragments, voices raised in anger, sudden disruptions, but these moments are often not enough to construct a full understanding of risk. Human beings are also conditioned to normalize partial information, to interpret it as temporary rather than indicative of deeper danger. Inside the apartment, however, the accumulation of unresolved emotional tension created an environment where stability became increasingly fragile. Every interaction carried residual emotional weight from previous disagreements. In such conditions, communication does not reset after each conversation but continues to build layer upon layer until even minor triggers can produce disproportionate reactions. This is often how escalation occurs in domestic environments, not through a single cause, but through the compression of multiple unresolved emotional states over time. Ashley's position within this environment was further complicated by isolation. Being in a foreign country reduces access to familiar support systems. Friends and family are no longer physically present, and communication becomes mediated through time differences and distance. While technology allows for contact, it does not fully replace the immediacy of physical presence. This creates a situation where emotional support exists, but at a reduced intensity, often insufficient to counterbalance the immediacy of lived experience in the environment where the individual is physically located. Jack's position within the relationship, as later interpreted through investigative and judicial findings, reflected a different set of emotional dynamics, particularly around control and emotional regulation. In relationships where dependency becomes central, the fear of separation can manifest as heightened emotional responses. These responses may not always be rationally controlled, especially when combined with other destabilizing factors such as substance use or pre-existing behavioral instability, as was later suggested in the case context. As February approached, the atmosphere within the apartment had shifted from initial optimism to something more strained and uncertain. The idea of a shared future, which once may have felt concrete during the early stages of the relationship, began to fracture under the weight of real-world interaction. Instead of a stable partnership forming through cohabitation, the relationship appeared to enter a phase of increasing volatility. Emotional exchanges became less about resolution and more about reaction. Yet even in this period, there is no simple external sign that would have clearly predicted the exact outcome. Domestic environments rarely present themselves in a way that clearly signals impending tragedy. Instead, they are defined by ambiguity, by moments that could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on perspective. What feels like tension to one person may feel like conflict resolution to another. What feels like fear internally may appear externally as disagreement or adjustment. The apartment in Chelmsford remained physically unchanged throughout this period. Walls did not shift, rooms did not alter, furniture remained in place. And yet the psychological meaning of the space transformed significantly for those inside it. A home, in the most basic sense, is meant to provide stability, but in this case, it became the stage upon which emotional instability gradually concentrated. The difference between a shared living space and a psychologically safe environment is not architectural but relational. It is defined not by walls, but by the emotional dynamics that occur within them. By the time the final days arrived, the environment inside that apartment had already undergone a transformation that was not visible from the outside. What remained was not a sudden collapse of normality, but the final expression of a process that had been unfolding over time, shaped by emotional dependence, isolation, escalating tension, and the absence of external intervention strong enough to interrupt its trajectory. The setting itself did not cause what happened, but it contained it, absorbed it, and ultimately became the silent witness to its conclusion. Ashley Wadsworth was 19 years old, but those who knew her often described her in a way that made age feel like an incomplete measure of who she was. There are people who move loudly through life, leaving strong impressions wherever they go, and then there are people like Ashley, whose presence is quieter, more contained, but no less meaningful to the small circle of those who truly see them. She came from British Columbia, a place defined by wide natural landscapes, cold air that carries a kind of clarity, and communities where familiarity often stretches across years rather than moments. In that environment, Ashley was known as someone gentle, reserved, and deeply thoughtful. She was not the kind of person who sought attention or dominance in social spaces. Instead, she observed, listened, and maintained relationships with a kind of steady sincerity that made her trusted by those around her. Her life before the events in England did not appear, on the surface, to contain the kind of instability that would later define her final chapter. Friends and family described her as soft-spoken, someone who preferred meaningful connection over large social circles. She was not isolated in a dramatic sense, but she lived within a quieter emotional world, one where trust was built slowly and relationships carried significant weight once formed. In many ways, this emotional style made her particularly vulnerable to the intensity of long-distance connection, where emotional consistency can feel like proof of something real, even when physical presence is absent. Ashley's connection with Jack Seppel began during her teenage years, a period of life where identity is still forming and emotional experiences often feel more absolute than they are. Meeting through online platforms, their relationship developed in the digital space first, where communication is continuous but filtered, and where distance can create a kind of emotional idealization. Over time, the two maintained contact across years, building a relationship that existed through messages, calls, and shared digital presence. For Ashley, this connection became a central part of her emotional world. It was not just a casual relationship, but something that gradually became intertwined with her sense of future possibility. There is a particular psychological dynamic that can form in long-distance relationships that begin at a young age. Without physical cohabitation, much of the relationship is constructed through narrative and emotional interpretation rather than shared daily reality. Each person fills in the gaps of the other's life with imagination, assumptions, and selective disclosure. Over time, this can create a version of the relationship that feels stable and deeply bonded, even though it has never been fully tested in the conditions of ordinary, shared living. For Ashley, this long period of emotional investment contributed to a sense of certainty about the relationship's direction. The idea of eventually being together physically was not a sudden decision, but a continuation of something that had already existed for years in another form. When she made the decision to leave Canada and move to England, it was not framed in her mind as a leap into the unknown, but as the realization of something already established. The journey across the Atlantic was, in her perspective, the transition from distance to presence, from waiting to finally living the life that had been emotionally constructed over time. This is an important distinction, because it shows how powerful long-term digital relationships can become when they are sustained without interruption. They do not feel artificial to those inside them. They feel accumulated, meaningful, and real. Those close to Ashley did not necessarily perceive her decision as reckless in a simplistic sense. Instead, it was understood as an emotionally significant step, one that she believed in deeply. At 19, she was at an age where many people begin making decisions that define their independence. Moving to another country for someone you love, while risky in hindsight, can feel at the moment like an affirmation of commitment and trust. For Ashley, this move represented not only a relationship milestone, but also a personal belief in the future she had envisioned. When she arrived in Chelmsford, She entered a new phase of her life that was no longer mediated by distance or digital communication. She was now physically present in the life of the person she had known for years, sharing space, routines, and the immediate realities of daily coexistence. This transition often reveals aspects of a relationship that were previously invisible. Personality traits that seemed minor in conversation can become amplified in shared living conditions. Emotional responses that were once delayed or softened by distance become immediate and unavoidable. Ashley's experience in England was shaped not only by her relationship, but also by her adaptation to a completely different environment. She had left behind the familiarity of Canadian life, including her support network, her cultural context, and the subtle comfort of knowing how to navigate everyday interactions without effort. In Chelmsford, everything required adjustment. Even simple routines carry the weight of unfamiliarity. In such conditions, emotional reliance on a partner can naturally increase, especially when that partner is the primary connection to the surrounding world. In the early period of her stay, there may have still been moments of optimism, moments where the idea of finally being together physically reinforced the emotional foundation of the relationship. But as time progressed, the reality of cohabitation introduced pressures that the long-distance phase had never fully exposed. Daily life does not exist in highlight moments. It is built from repetition, small interactions, and the accumulation of unspoken emotional exchanges. It is within this accumulation that tension often begins to form. Ashley's personality, described as gentle and non-confrontational, likely influenced how she navigated the growing complexity of the relationship. People with such temperaments often prioritize emotional harmony and may internalize discomfort rather than express it immediately in direct confrontation. This does not mean absence of resistance, but rather a gradual internalization of concern before it becomes externalized as action. In the context of a relationship that was beginning to show signs of emotional instability, this dynamic may have contributed to a growing internal sense of unease that was not immediately visible to others. Reports from later investigations suggested that Ashley began to feel increasingly uncomfortable in the environment she was living in. The feeling of not being safe is rarely sudden in such contexts. It often develops gradually through repeated emotional signals that accumulate over time. Small arguments that leave lasting emotional residue. Moments of tension that are not fully resolved. Shifts in behavior that create uncertainty about emotional stability within the relationship. These elements do not always appear dramatic individually, but together they can create a persistent sense of instability. Her reported desire to return to Canada reflects a significant psychological turning point. It indicates that the emotional balance had shifted from anticipation of a shared future to concern about present circumstances. This kind of shift is critical in understanding domestic escalation because it represents the moment where internal perception of safety changes. Once that perception changes, every interaction within the environment is interpreted differently, often with heightened sensitivity to emotional cues. Ashley's position was further complicated by distance from her family. In situations where individuals are geographically isolated from their support systems, decision-making becomes more complex. The process of leaving a relationship is not simply emotional but logistical, especially when international travel, financial independence, and physical relocation are involved. This complexity can create delay between recognition of discomfort and action taken to address it. During that delay, emotional tension within the relationship can intensify. At the same time, Jack's presence in her life had become not only romantic but central to her daily existence in England. This creates a psychological structure where the relationship is both the source of comfort and the source of distress, which can make emotional decision-making extremely difficult. The same person who represents familiarity and connection is also the one through whom instability is experienced. This duality is one of the most challenging aspects of emotionally dependent relationships. As February approached, Ashley's emotional world was likely defined by contradiction. On one side, there was the history of years spent believing in the relationship. On the other side, there was the immediate lived experience of discomfort and concern. These two realities can exist simultaneously for a period of time, creating internal conflict that does not resolve easily. It is within this space of contradiction that many people struggle to make decisions, especially when the external environment does not offer clear pathways of support. Ashley Wadsworth's story, at its core, is not defined solely by its tragic ending, but by the emotional journey that preceded it. It is a story of a young woman who formed a deep emotional bond across distance, who made a significant life decision based on long-term trust, and who entered a new environment with hope that gradually became complicated by lived experience. Her character, as described by those around her, was not one of recklessness but of emotional sincerity, a person who believed deeply in the authenticity of the connection she formed. The tragedy of her case lies in the collision between emotional belief and physical reality, between the version of a relationship constructed over years of distance and the version that emerged under the pressure of cohabitation. In that space between expectation and experience, Ashley's final chapter began to take shape, not as a sudden rupture, but as a gradual accumulation of emotional weight that would ultimately lead to irreversible consequences. By the time February 1st, 2022 arrived, there was nothing externally remarkable about the day in Chelmsford. It was a winter day in England, the kind of day where the sky remains low and gray, pressing down on rooftops and streets with a quiet heaviness that seems to dull everything beneath it. Life outside continued in its ordinary rhythm, unaware that inside one of the residential apartments, a sequence of events was unfolding that would end in irreversible violence. For Ashley Wadsworth, this day was not supposed to be the end of anything. It was part of a life she had recently chosen, a life she had traveled across an ocean to begin. But within the confined space of that apartment, the emotional tensions that had been building over time reached a breaking point that would permanently alter the trajectory of multiple lives. In the hours leading up to the incident, the environment inside the apartment was already charged with emotional instability. The relationship between Ashley and Jack Seppel had, according to later investigative findings, been deteriorating under the weight of repeated conflict and emotional strain. While the exact details of every conversation that took place that day remain known only through fragments of evidence and reconstructed timelines, the broader context suggests a pattern of escalating tension that had been developing over preceding weeks. This was not a sudden rupture from a state of calm, but rather the culmination of a process in which emotional control had become increasingly fragile. At the center of this instability was Ashley's growing desire to leave the situation and return to Canada. This intention represented more than just a logistical decision. It was a psychological shift, a reassertion of independence in a relationship that had begun to feel unsafe. For someone already living in a foreign country, far from family and familiar support systems, the decision to leave carries immense emotional and practical weight. It requires planning, communication, and most importantly, the ability to safely disengage from a partner who may not respond well to separation. In many domestic violence cases, this stage is recognized as one of the most dangerous moments because it introduces the possibility of loss of control for the other party. Within the apartment, this underlying reality created an atmosphere of heightened emotional sensitivity. Conversations that might otherwise have been routine became charged with implication. The idea of separation, once abstract, had become concrete. Ashley was no longer simply thinking about the relationship. She was reconsidering its continuation. This shift is often perceived intensely by the other partner, especially in relationships where emotional dependency or control dynamics are present. The perception of imminent departure can trigger reactions that escalate beyond verbal conflict. On that day, the apartment itself became a closed system, cut off from external moderation. There were no interruptions from outside life that might have diffused tension. No neutral space where emotions could be reset. Everything occurred within a confined environment where emotional responses could intensify without relief. In such conditions, the boundary between argument and crisis can become dangerously thin. At some point during the final interaction, the situation escalated from verbal conflict into physical violence. The exact sequence of words exchanged in those final moments has not been fully reconstructed in public detail, but what is known is that the confrontation moved into Ashley's bedroom, a space that should have represented privacy and safety, but instead became the setting for the final and most devastating act of the incident. It is within this enclosed space that the physical attack began. The assault itself involved multiple stages of violence. It began with strangulation, an act that requires close physical proximity and sustained force, indicating not only intent but also prolonged engagement with the victim during the act. Strangulation is particularly significant in forensic and psychological analysis because it reflects a level of control over the victim's ability to breathe, speak, and resist. It is an act that unfolds over time rather than occurring instantaneously, creating a window in which the situation continues to escalate. Following this initial phase, the violence intensified into a sustained knife attack. The number of injuries inflicted was later determined to be approximately 90 stab wounds. This detail is not simply a statistic, but a reflection of the intensity and duration of the attack. In forensic interpretation, such a number suggests repeated and forceful actions, far beyond what would be necessary to cause death. It reflects a state in which the violence continued well after lethal injury had already been inflicted. Ashley died within that room as a result of these injuries, primarily due to extensive blood loss. The combination of strangulation and repeated stabbing created a situation in which survival was not possible. The bedroom, which had once been part of an ordinary domestic setting, became the final physical space of her life. The transformation of a private room into a scene of fatal violence is one of the most haunting aspects of domestic homicide cases because it collapses the boundary between intimacy and destruction. What makes this moment particularly difficult to comprehend is not only the brutality of the act itself, but the sudden collapse of all prior expectations. There is no public record of any external intervention during the critical moments of escalation. No neighbor entering the apartment, no immediate disruption from outside forces. The violence unfolded within the closed system of the household, isolated from immediate interruption. After the attack, the behavior of Jack Seppel diverged from what might typically be expected in cases of attempted concealment or escape. Instead of fleeing the scene, he remained within the apartment. In a highly unusual development, he recorded a video on his phone in which he acknowledged what had occurred. In that recording, Ashley's body was visible in the background, and he reportedly admitted to having killed her. His demeanor, as later described through investigative references, reflected emotional distress and instability rather than calculated evasion. He also contacted emergency services himself, effectively initiating the arrival of law enforcement. This act introduced complexity into the interpretation of his mental and emotional state at the time. While some cases involve immediate attempts to destroy evidence or flee jurisdiction, this case presented a scenario in which the perpetrator remained on site and actively engaged with authorities. Such behavior can be interpreted in multiple ways, ranging from emotional collapse to disorientation following extreme violence. When police arrived at the scene, they were confronted with a completed crime scene rather than an ongoing incident. The apartment was secured, and Jack Seppel was taken into custody without resistance. The weapon used in the attack was recovered during the initial response. The video evidence on his phone, combined with the physical evidence within the apartment, immediately provided investigators with a clear indication of what had occurred. For first responders and investigators, scenes like this are not only procedural challenges but also emotional ones. They involve processing a situation where a young life has already been lost in a highly violent manner, while simultaneously securing evidence and establishing control over the environment. Every object within the space becomes part of a larger narrative that must be reconstructed later in detail. Outside the apartment, the world remained unchanged in its routine patterns. There was no immediate public awareness of what had occurred inside. Neighbors may have continued their day, unaware that one of the most severe domestic homicide cases in the region had just taken place within a nearby residence. This disconnect between internal tragedy and external normality is one of the most striking features of such cases. Life outside does not pause, even when life inside has ended. By the end of February 1st, the initial phase of the investigation had begun, but the emotional reality of what had happened was already fixed. A young woman who had crossed continents in search of love had been killed inside the home she believed would represent a new beginning. The incident itself was not just an isolated act of violence, but the final point in a chain of emotional and relational developments that had been building over time. What remained at this stage was not yet justice, nor explanation, but the stark reality of irreversible loss contained within the walls of a single apartment that had transformed from a shared living space into the center of a homicide investigation. When police first stepped into the apartment in Chelmsford, they were not entering a space of uncertainty about what had happened in the most basic sense. The situation had already been partially revealed through the actions of the suspect himself, but what remained was the full physical confirmation of a reality that no amount of prior briefing can truly prepare investigators for. The threshold between hallway and interior is often where cases shift from abstract reports into concrete trauma. Inside, the air carries a stillness that feels unnatural, not because it is silent, but because it has stopped participating in ordinary life. The bedroom where Ashley Wadsworth was found had become the center of everything. In forensic investigations, a bedroom is usually associated with rest, privacy, and routine human vulnerability. In this case, it had been transformed into something entirely different, a sealed environment where violence had reached its final form. The positioning of objects, the condition of surfaces, and the spatial arrangement of the room were no longer domestic details. They were evidence. Every visual element had to be treated as part of a timeline that needed reconstruction. Ashley was found inside that space, and the condition of the scene immediately indicated the severity of what had taken place. The physical evidence reflected a sustained and extreme level of violence, consistent with the later confirmed findings of strangulation, followed by multiple stab wounds. For investigators, the number of injuries is not just a shocking detail for public consumption, but a critical factor in understanding the nature of the attack. The intensity suggested prolonged physical engagement, repeated force, and a breakdown of any moment where the situation could have been interrupted or reversed. One of the most significant early discoveries was the presence of a mobile phone video recorded by Jack Seppel shortly after the attack. This piece of evidence changed the trajectory of the investigation almost immediately. In many homicide cases, investigators must rely on physical reconstruction and witness statements to infer intent and sequence. Here, however, there was direct audio-visual material that captured the aftermath in real time. The video reportedly showed Ashley's body in the background while Jack spoke directly to the camera, acknowledging what had occurred and expressing emotional distress. This type of self-recorded evidence is rare, and it introduces a raw, unfiltered perspective that no external testimony can replicate. The presence of this recording also influenced the initial interpretation of events by investigators. It suggested that the situation had not transitioned into a prolonged attempt to conceal the crime. Instead, it appeared to reflect a moment of immediate psychological collapse or disorientation following the act itself. However, even in the presence of apparent confession, investigators are trained to treat all evidence with procedural caution. Emotional expression does not replace legal analysis, and every detail still required verification through physical and forensic examination. As officers secured the apartment, the process of documenting the scene began with meticulous attention to detail. In cases of this severity, nothing is considered insignificant. Blood patterns, weapon location, signs of struggle, and even subtle disturbances in the environment all contribute to reconstructing the sequence of events. The bedroom was photographed extensively from multiple angles before any objects were moved. The goal at this stage is not interpretation but preservation, ensuring that the original state of a scene is captured before any alteration occurs through necessary investigative procedures. The weapon believed to have been used in the attack was recovered within the apartment. Its placement and condition provided further context for the timeline of events. Alongside this, investigators also began collecting trace evidence that could support forensic analysis, including biological samples and any material that might link the suspect to specific actions during the incident. Each piece of evidence would later be subjected to laboratory analysis, but at the scene itself, the priority is stabilization and documentation. Outside the immediate bedroom, the rest of the apartment reflected a disturbing contrast between normal domestic life and the violence that had occurred within it. Everyday objects remained in place, untouched by the intensity of what had unfolded in one specific room. This separation between ordinary surroundings and extreme violence is a recurring psychological element in domestic homicide scenes. It reinforces the sense that tragedy does not always consume an entire environment, but can instead concentrate itself in a single point within it. As the scene was secured, attention also turned to the suspect, Jack Seppel, who was still present in the apartment when police arrived. He was taken into custody without resistance. His condition at the time, as later understood through investigative reports, reflected a state of emotional instability. The fact that he had remained at the scene and contacted authorities himself added complexity to the initial assessment. In many cases, suspects attempt to flee or distance themselves from the location. Here, however, there was no attempt to physically escape, which immediately shaped the early narrative of the investigation. During the initial questioning phase, which began after standard procedural safeguards were established, investigators focused on establishing a clear timeline of events. However, early stages of homicide investigations are not about extracting full narratives immediately. They are about securing basic factual consistency. Who was present, what occurred, and in what order? Given the severity of the evidence already available, much of the foundational structure of the case was already visible before formal interrogation began. Neighbors in the building became an important source of supplementary information during these early hours. Some reported hearing raised voices coming from the apartment earlier in the day, describing moments of shouting that broke the otherwise normal quiet of the residential environment. These accounts, while not precise in content, helped establish that there had been audible conflict prior to the discovery of the crime. In domestic cases, such external observations often form the only bridge between private escalation and public awareness. Other neighbors described a sense of unease in retrospect, noting that while disturbances had been heard before, they had not fully understood their significance at the time. This is a common pattern in residential settings, where partial sensory information is often normalized or dismissed unless it becomes persistent or clearly alarming. Human perception tends to interpret isolated disturbances as temporary rather than indicative of ongoing danger, especially when no visible signs of distress are present. Inside the investigative process, attention also turned to digital evidence beyond the immediate video recorded by the suspect. Phones, messages, and communication history often provide crucial context in domestic homicide cases, particularly those involving long-distance relationships that transitioned into cohabitation. These digital traces can reveal patterns of emotional interaction, escalation, and intent that are not always visible in physical evidence alone. As the initial crime scene processing continued, investigators began constructing a preliminary timeline that would later be refined through forensic analysis and formal statements. What emerged at this early stage was a picture of a relationship that had undergone significant strain prior to the final incident, consistent with later confirmed accounts of emotional instability and conflict. However, at the scene itself, these broader interpretations remained secondary to the immediate task of preserving evidence. The emotional weight of the discovery also extended beyond the technical aspects of the investigation. For officers on site, cases involving young victims who have moved internationally carry a particular psychological impact. There is an added awareness of distance, of separation from family, and of the abrupt interruption of a life that was still in its early stages of development. While professionals are trained to maintain procedural focus, the human reality of the situation is never entirely absent. By the end of the initial processing phase, the apartment had been transformed from a domestic space into a fully documented crime scene. Every object, every surface, every trace of disturbance had been recorded for further analysis. What remained was not just a physical location, but a structured archive of evidence that would form the foundation of the legal case to follow. The discovery phase of the investigation did not provide emotional closure or narrative understanding. Instead, it provided something more immediate and more stark: confirmation. Confirmation that what had begun as a private relationship across distance had ended in a contained act of extreme violence within a single room, and that the responsibility for reconstructing its full meaning would now shift entirely into the hands of investigators, forensic experts, and ultimately the justice system. In the hours and days following the discovery of Ashley Wadsworth's body, the investigation entered a phase that is often the most complex in any homicide case, not because the facts are unclear, but because clarity at the scene does not always translate into immediate understanding of motive, psychology, and sequence. Even when a suspect is already in custody and physical evidence strongly indicates responsibility, investigators are still required to reconstruct the full context in a way that will hold up under legal scrutiny. In this case, the presence of a confession video and the suspect's immediate detention created the appearance of simplicity on the surface, but beneath that surface, the investigative process still had to navigate layers of emotional, relational, and behavioral interpretation. From the beginning, Jack Seppel was identified as the central figure in the investigation. His proximity to the victim, his presence at the scene, and the recorded admission he made shortly after the incident positioned him as the primary suspect without the ambiguity that often defines early-stage homicide inquiries. However, in formal investigative practice, even apparent certainty must be tested against procedure. Detectives needed to establish not just that he committed the act, but how and why the situation escalated to that point, and whether any external factors contributed to the sequence of events. One of the first areas of focus was the timeline leading up to the incident. Investigators worked to map out the final hours of Ashley's life using a combination of digital evidence, witness statements, and physical forensic analysis. This included examining communication patterns between Ashley and Jack, looking for indicators of escalating conflict, emotional distress, or plans to leave the residence. In domestic homicide cases, the period immediately preceding the act is often critical as it can reveal escalation patterns that are not visible in earlier stages of the relationship. At the same time, officers began formal interviews with individuals who had indirect contact with the couple. Neighbors in the building provided early but valuable insights. Some recalled hearing raised voices from the apartment, describing moments of shouting that disrupted the otherwise quiet residential environment. These accounts, while not detailed in content, helped confirm that there had been audible conflict prior to the incident. Importantly, none of the neighbors reported witnessing physical violence directly, which is consistent with many domestic cases where escalation occurs behind closed doors and is only partially perceptible from outside. These fragmented observations played a role in establishing the broader behavioral environment within the apartment. Investigators understand that domestic violence rarely presents itself in fully visible form to external witnesses. Instead, it often exists in layers of private interaction punctuated by external signs that may not be fully understood at the time they occur. The challenge for detectives is to assemble these fragments into a coherent pattern that reflects the internal reality of the relationship. Digital forensics became a central pillar of the investigation. The analysis of mobile phones and electronic communications provided insight into the emotional dynamics between Ashley and Jack in the weeks leading up to the incident. While specific private messages were treated as evidentiary material within the case file, the general pattern that emerged was consistent with reports of increasing tension and emotional instability. Communication in the final period appeared to reflect uncertainty, disagreement, and the growing possibility of separation. In cases involving young couples, especially those who transition from long-distance relationships to cohabitation, digital communication history often becomes one of the most important sources of context. It can reveal shifts in tone, frequency, and emotional content that may correspond with real-world behavioral changes. For investigators, this information is not used in isolation, but as part of a broader reconstruction of relational dynamics. Another critical element of the investigation involved forensic examination of the crime scene itself beyond the immediate bedroom where the fatal attack occurred. The spatial layout of the apartment, signs of movement, and distribution of evidence were analyzed to determine the sequence of events. Blood pattern analysis, in particular, helps establish movement and intensity during violent encounters, allowing investigators to infer positions, transitions, and duration of physical interaction. In this case, the forensic evidence supported the conclusion of a prolonged and highly violent confrontation within a confined space. The presence of the recorded video made by Jack Seppel shortly after the incident also became a key evidentiary component. While emotionally disturbing in nature, it provided investigators with immediate post-incident behavioral data. In the video, his acknowledgement of the act and visible emotional distress contributed to an understanding of his psychological state at that moment. However, investigators were careful not to interpret the video as a standalone explanation of intent or mental condition. Instead, it was treated as one piece within a larger evidentiary framework. As the investigation progressed, attention also turned to Jack's background, including his prior behavioral history, personal circumstances and any factors that might help contextualize his actions. In homicide investigations, background analysis is not used to justify behavior, but to understand potential contributing influences that may have shaped decision-making patterns. This includes examining past relationships, behavioral reports, and any documented signs of instability or aggression. The concept of emotional control within the relationship also became a subject of investigative interest. Based on available evidence and later court findings, the relationship exhibited characteristics consistent with emotional volatility and control-related tension. These dynamics are particularly significant in domestic homicide cases, where escalation is often tied not only to immediate conflict but to longer-term patterns of dependency and perceived loss of control. Despite the apparent clarity of responsibility, investigators still had to ensure that the legal standards for prosecution were fully satisfied. This meant verifying every element of the case through independent evidence, ensuring chain of custody for physical materials, and corroborating digital findings with witness testimony and forensic results. The legal system requires not only truth, but structured proof that can withstand courtroom examination. During this phase, Ashley's family in Canada was formally notified and began to engage with authorities across jurisdictions. International cases introduce additional procedural layers, including coordination between law enforcement agencies and consular support. For families, this stage is often marked by emotional devastation combined with procedural complexity as they navigate both grief and the formal processes surrounding repatriation and legal proceedings. Public awareness of the case began to grow as information gradually became available through official channels and media reporting. However, investigators typically operate with caution during early stages of homicide inquiries, releasing limited details to preserve evidentiary integrity. This balance between public interest and investigative confidentiality is a standard part of major criminal cases, particularly those involving young victims and high emotional impact. Within the investigative team, the case quickly evolved from an active inquiry into a structured prosecution file. The combination of confession, forensic evidence, and digital documentation created a strong evidentiary foundation. However, the psychological interpretation of events remained more complex. Understanding why the relationship deteriorated to the point of lethal violence requires more than physical evidence. It requires careful reconstruction of emotional trajectories over time. As the investigation moved forward, the focus gradually shifted from immediate fact-finding to preparation for legal proceedings. This included compiling comprehensive reports, organizing forensic findings into admissible formats, and preparing witness statements for court presentation. Every detail had to be carefully structured to ensure that the narrative of events was supported by verifiable evidence rather than assumption. By the end of this phase, the investigation had reached a point of procedural consolidation. The central facts were established, the primary suspect was in custody, and the evidentiary framework was largely complete. What remained was the transition from investigation to justice process, where the raw reality of what had occurred would be examined in a formal legal setting. As the investigation transitioned into the judicial phase, the case of Ashley Wadsworth entered a different kind of gravity, one that no longer belonged to the crime scene or the immediate urgency of police work, but to the structured, procedural world of the courtroom. This is the stage where facts are no longer simply discovered, but tested, organized, and presented in a way that must withstand legal scrutiny, defense challenge, and the formal requirements of justice. For a case that already appeared straightforward in terms of responsibility, this phase was not about determining who committed the act, but about understanding how the law would define it, and how the narrative of events would be formally established in front of a judge and jury. Jack Seppel's early position in the legal process was shaped heavily by the evidence already collected during the investigation. The combination of his presence at the scene, the physical forensic findings, and the recorded video in which he acknowledged the killing created a case that did not rely on inference or indirect suspicion. In many homicide trials, prosecutors must construct intent through layered evidence and behavioral interpretation. In this case, however, the evidentiary structure was already direct and heavily concentrated. The legal question was not whether he caused Ashley's death, but how the court would categorize the nature of that act within the framework of criminal responsibility. As proceedings advanced, Jack Seppel formally admitted guilt to the charge of murder. This plea removed the need for a full contested trial on the question of factual responsibility, shifting the courtroom's focus towards sentencing and legal characterization. In doing so, the emotional weight of the case moved from evidentiary debate into judicial evaluation. The courtroom was no longer a place to uncover truth, but to measure its consequences in legal terms. During sentencing discussions, the court was presented with a detailed reconstruction of the events leading to Ashley's death. Prosecutors outlined the progression from relationship tension to final confrontation, emphasizing the escalation of violence within a domestic setting. The brutality of the attack, particularly the combination of strangulation and multiple stab wounds, was highlighted as evidence of extreme and sustained violence. In legal terms, such details are not used for emotional amplification but for classification, helping the court determine the severity of culpability and the appropriate sentencing range. The judge in the case described the actions as exceptionally violent and emphasized the devastating nature of the loss suffered by Ashley's family. Judicial language in such cases is carefully chosen, balancing the need to acknowledge harm with the requirement of legal precision. The court also considered the broader context of domestic violence dynamics, particularly the fact that the relationship had involved emotional instability and signs of escalating conflict prior to the incident. While these factors do not mitigate responsibility for the act itself, they are often referenced to frame the environment in which the offense occurred. Defense representation, as a standard in such proceedings, had limited scope for contesting factual guilt due to the admission and overwhelming evidence. Instead, legal arguments tended to focus on contextual elements, including the psychological state of the defendant at the time of the offense. In cases involving sudden violent escalation, defense submissions may attempt to introduce factors such as emotional distress or impaired judgment. However, the severity and nature of the injuries, along with the post-incident behavior captured in the video evidence, weighed heavily in the court's overall assessment. One of the most significant aspects considered during sentencing was the presence of pre- and post-incident behavior that demonstrated awareness of actions taken. The recorded video, in which Jack Seppel acknowledged the killing and contacted authorities, was treated as part of the behavioral timeline rather than as an isolated emotional expression. It contributed to the court's understanding that the incident occurred within a moment of extreme psychological instability, but it did not alter the legal classification of the act as murder. Ashley Wadsworth's family provided victim impact statements that were presented to the court, describing not only the emotional devastation caused by her death, but also the circumstances in which she had left Canada to pursue a life abroad. These statements are a crucial part of sentencing in homicide cases, as they allow the court to understand the human impact beyond forensic and legal definitions. The loss of a young life, particularly one involving international relocation and separation from family, added a profound emotional dimension to the proceedings. In delivering its final judgment, the court imposed a life sentence on Jack Seppel. In the legal framework of England and Wales, a life sentence does not necessarily imply immediate release after a fixed period, but rather establishes a minimum term that must be served before eligibility for parole is considered. The court's decision reflected the seriousness of the offense, the degree of violence involved, and the broader context of domestic homicide. The sentencing emphasized that the act represented a complete and irreversible breach of human life within an intimate domestic setting. Throughout the courtroom proceedings, there was a consistent tension between legal structure and human tragedy. While the law operates through classification, procedure, and precedent, the reality underlying this case resisted reduction to purely legal terms. The court was required to translate an act of extreme personal violence into structured language of offense categories and sentencing guidelines, but the emotional weight of the case remained evident in the background of every statement delivered. For observers, both within the legal system and in the wider public, the case highlighted the intersection between modern relationships, digital connectivity, and real-world vulnerability. Ashley's journey from Canada to England was not just a personal decision, but part of a broader pattern seen in long-distance relationships that transition into physical cohabitation. The courtroom proceedings, while focused on legal responsibility, inevitably reflected these broader social dynamics. As the sentencing concluded, the judicial process formally closed the question of criminal liability. The defendant was held accountable within the full extent of the law, and the case transitioned out of active courtroom proceedings into the category of concluded legal matters. However, the resolution in legal terms did not equate to emotional closure for those affected. The family of Ashley Wadsworth, the investigators who worked the case, and even members of the public who followed the proceedings were left with the enduring reality of the loss that had occurred. In the end, the courtroom did what it is designed to do. It defined responsibility, imposed consequence, and recorded judgment within the framework of law. But what it could not do was restore what had been taken. The life of a 19-year-old woman, once shaped by possibility and distance-bound hope, had been reduced to a sequence of legal findings and a final sentence. The justice system could account for the act, but it could not reverse the absence it left behind. When the legal proceedings concluded and the formal sentence was delivered, what remained was not resolution in the emotional sense, but a lingering silence that often follows cases of domestic homicide. Courtrooms are designed to reach conclusions, to assign responsibility, and to close procedural loops within the justice system, yet they cannot fully contain the human aftermath that extends far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For Ashley Wadsworth's family, the end of the trial marked not an ending, but a permanent confirmation of loss that had already been felt since the moment they learned of her death in England. Ashley's family, thousands of kilometers away in Canada, experienced the case through a combination of official communication, media coverage, and court statements. No legal document or formal judgment can replicate the lived reality of receiving news that a daughter, a sister, a loved one who had left home in pursuit of a new life, would never return. In cases involving international relocation, grief is often compounded by distance, because the physical separation between family and the site of tragedy creates an additional layer of helplessness. They were not present at the apartment in Chelmsford, not present at the moment investigators arrived, not present at the scene where Ashley's life ended, yet they were forced to reconstruct those final moments through evidence, reports, and courtroom descriptions. During the sentencing phase, victim impact statements became one of the most emotionally significant elements of the proceedings. These statements, read into the court record, carry the voice of a family attempting to articulate a loss that defies structured language. They spoke not only about Ashley as a victim of crime, but as a daughter who had made a decision to trust, to love, and to build a future in a different country. The emotional weight of those statements highlighted a central truth that often emerges in homicide cases. The legal system defines events in terms of acts and consequences, while families experience them as absence, interruption, and irreversible change. In the aftermath of the trial, public discourse around the case began to expand beyond the courtroom narrative. The circumstances of Ashley's death, involving a young woman who had moved abroad for a long-distance relationship, prompted broader reflection on the risks associated with digital relationships that transition into physical cohabitation. While online relationships are a normal part of modern social interaction, this case highlighted how emotional bonds formed over distance can sometimes obscure critical warning signs that only become visible when the relationship enters real-world conditions. There was also discussion about emotional dependency and isolation, particularly in situations where one partner relocates internationally. When a person moves to a new country for a relationship, they often lose immediate access to familiar support systems. Friends and family are no longer physically present, and the surrounding environment is unfamiliar. This creates a condition where the partner becomes not only a romantic figure, but also the primary source of emotional stability, social interaction, and daily structure. In such circumstances, any instability within the relationship can have amplified psychological impact because there are fewer external anchors to provide balance. Ashley's case became part of a wider conversation about domestic violence awareness, particularly in relationships that may not initially appear threatening from the outside. One of the most difficult aspects of domestic violence is that it often develops within private spaces, shielded from public observation. Neighbors may hear fragments of conflict, friends may notice changes in communication, but the full picture is rarely visible until a critical point is reached. This case reinforced the importance of recognizing early signs of emotional control, escalating conflict, and feelings of unsafety within relationships, even when those relationships are built on long-standing emotional connection. At the same time, it is important to understand that hindsight often creates the illusion of clarity. From the outside, it is easy to identify moments that appear like warning signs. From within the lived experience of a relationship, however, those same moments can feel ambiguous, intermittent, or open to interpretation. Emotional attachment, history, and hope often complicate decision-making in ways that are not easily captured in retrospective analysis. Ashley's situation reflected this complexity, where long-term emotional investment intersected with emerging discomfort in a way that did not produce immediate or simple conclusions. The justice process, while definitive in legal terms, also raises questions about prevention rather than only punishment. Once a case reaches the stage of homicide, the system's role becomes reactive rather than preventive. Courts can assign responsibility and impose sentences, but they cannot intervene in the relational dynamics that led to the violence before it occurred. This limitation is not unique to this case, but is inherent in how criminal justice systems operate. The deeper challenge lies in identifying risk earlier, particularly in domestic environments where external visibility is limited. For those who follow the case publicly, there was a strong emotional response to the contrast between Ashley's age, her circumstances, and the severity of what happened to her. 19 years old represents a stage of life associated with transition, possibility, and exploration. In this case, that stage intersected with a relationship that had already spanned several years and geographical boundaries, culminating in a decision that carried profound consequences. The emotional resonance of this contrast contributed to the widespread attention the case received. Within the broader societal context, the case also reflects the evolving nature of relationships in a digital age. Long-distance relationships supported by constant communication can create a sense of closeness that feels as real as physical proximity. However, the transition from digital connection to physical cohabitation introduces variables that cannot be fully anticipated through online interaction alone. Personality dynamics, emotional regulation, and conflict resolution all manifest differently in shared physical space than they do through mediated communication. As the case receded from active legal proceedings, what remained was not only the memory of the event itself, but the ongoing impact on those directly affected. For Ashley's family, life continues in the absence of her presence, shaped by memory and grief rather than closure. For investigators and legal professionals involved, the case becomes part of a larger pattern of domestic homicide cases that inform future understanding and training. For the public, it becomes a reference point in discussions about relationships, safety, and awareness. There is no single interpretation that fully contains the meaning of what happened in Chelmsford. Legally, it is a concluded case with a defined outcome. Emotionally, it is an unresolved absence. Socially, it is a reminder of the fragile boundary between trust and vulnerability in intimate relationships. And humanly, it is the story of a young woman who left her home believing she was stepping into a shared future, only to find that the reality she entered would end her life far too soon. The aftermath of the case does not offer answers that feel complete. Instead, it leaves behind questions that extend beyond the courtroom into the spaces where relationships form, where trust is built, and where warning signs are sometimes recognized too late. When a case like this reaches its final legal conclusion, there is a tendency for the public mind to search for a sense of completion, as if a sentence handed down in court could also bring emotional resolution to everything that came before it. But the story of Ashley Wadsworth resists that kind of closure. What remains after the investigation, after the trial, after the formal declaration of guilt and sentencing, is not an ending that feels complete, but a quiet and persistent absence that continues to echo far beyond the courtroom walls. It is the absence of a 19-year-old life that once held ordinary plans, private hopes, and a future that was still unfolding in ways she could not yet fully know. Ashley's story is often discussed in the context of domestic violence, but it is also a story about trust formed across distance, about how emotional connection can develop in spaces that are both deeply intimate and structurally limited at the same time. In long-distance relationships, especially those that begin during adolescence, emotional bonds are often built through sustained communication that creates a sense of closeness without physical verification. Over time, this can feel as real and stable as any in-person relationship because the emotional consistency becomes the primary measure of truth. For Ashley, Years of communication created a foundation of belief in a future that seemed already established before she ever set foot in England. The tragedy lies not only in what happened, but in the contrast between expectation and reality. She did not travel to Chelmsford with the intention of stepping into danger. She traveled with the expectation of continuation, of transforming a long-standing emotional connection into a lived reality. That expectation is what makes the outcome so difficult to process, because it disrupts the assumption that love, once proven over time and distance, will naturally translate into safety when brought into physical proximity. Instead, the case reveals how emotional certainty formed online can collide with real-world dynamics in ways that are not always predictable or visible in advance. In reflecting on the environment in which the events occurred, it is important to recognize that domestic spaces often conceal the most significant warning signs. From the outside, life continues in ordinary patterns. Neighbors hear fragments of sound but not full conversations. Observers may notice tension without understanding its depth. Even those close to the situation may not see the full progression of emotional change as it happens. This invisibility is one of the most challenging aspects of domestic violence because it develops in spaces that are physically close but socially hidden. Ashley's case also highlights the emotional complexity of leaving a relationship that has been long established across time. When a bond has existed for years, even across distance, it becomes intertwined with identity and future planning. The decision to leave is not simply a practical one, but an emotional rupture that involves reevaluating not only the present situation, but also the entire narrative that has been built over time. This is why moments of realization in such relationships are often gradual rather than immediate, marked by internal conflict rather than sudden clarity. The legal system, by its nature, operates after events have already occurred. It can assign responsibility, establish facts, and impose consequences, but it cannot intervene in the earlier emotional conditions that allow those events to unfold. In Ashley's case, the courtroom was able to define what happened in legal terms, but it could not reconstruct the lived emotional experience that led to that final moment inside the apartment. That gap between legal definition and human experience is where much of the complexity of this case resides. For her family, the aftermath is not defined by legal closure but by ongoing absence. The return of personal belongings, the formal acknowledgments, the procedural communications between countries, all of these are administrative steps that attempt to structure something that is fundamentally unstructured grief. There is no procedural equivalent for the loss of a child, no legal framework that can translate absence into resolution. What remains is memory and the continuous process of adjusting to a reality that no longer includes the person who was lost. Public response to the case reflected a broader awareness of the risks that can exist within relationships formed primarily through digital communication. While technology enables connection across distance, it also creates environments where emotional intimacy can develop without full exposure to the complexities of daily shared life. The transition from online communication to cohabitation is often treated as a natural progression in relationships, but cases like this demonstrate how that transition can also introduce unexpected emotional and relational pressures. At the same time, it is important not to reduce Ashley's story to a cautionary label. She was not defined by the circumstances of her death, but by the life she lived before it. She was a young woman who made a decision based on trust, connection, and belief in a future she thought was shared. That decision, while it ended in tragedy, was rooted in the same human desire for closeness and meaning that shapes relationships everywhere. To understand her story fully is to hold both truths at once, the vulnerability that existed within the situation and the sincerity of the intention behind her choices. The finality of the court's decision marks the end of legal proceedings, but not the end of reflection. Cases like this continue to exist in public memory because they raise questions that extend beyond the specific individuals involved. They invite consideration of how relationships form in the digital age, how emotional dependency develops, how isolation can shape decision-making, and how warning signs can be recognized earlier. These are not questions with simple answers, but they are necessary ones. In the end, the story of Ashley Wadsworth is not only about how her life ended, but about how it began, how it moved across borders, and how it was shaped by belief and connection. It is a reminder that behind every case file, every courtroom transcript, every headline, there is a human life that once existed outside of those definitions. A life that cannot be fully captured by legal language or investigative summaries. What remains is a responsibility to remember her not only as a name in a case, but as a person whose story reflects both the beauty and fragility of human connection in a world where distance is no longer a barrier to intimacy, but where emotional safety still depends on far more than proximity alone. In closing the narrative of this case, there is an unavoidable tension between what the law can define and what human experience can truly comprehend. The formal structure of justice has already spoken. The investigation has been completed, the courtroom has delivered its judgment, and the facts of what occurred inside that apartment in Chelmsford have been established through evidence, testimony, and forensic reconstruction. Yet even with all of that in place, the story of Ashley Wadsworth does not settle into something that feels finished. It remains present, not as an open case file, but as a human absence that continues to echo in the spaces she once occupied and in the lives of those who knew her. Ashley's life cannot be reduced to the final moments that defined her death. Before she became part of a criminal investigation, she was a young woman shaped by ordinary experiences that carried their own quiet significance. She grew up in Canada, in an environment where familiarity and distance from danger often create a sense of emotional safety that is only fully recognized in hindsight. Like many people her age, she navigated relationships, hopes, and future planning with a belief that emotional connection, once established and sustained, would naturally lead toward stability. That belief is not unusual. It is, in many ways, a fundamental part of how people form bonds with one another. The relationship that ultimately brought her to England did not begin with visible warning signs or immediate instability. It developed over time, across years of communication that created a sense of continuity and emotional investment. In that space, love was not defined by physical presence but by consistency of interaction, shared experience through conversation, and the gradual construction of trust. When that kind of bond extends over a long period, it can become deeply integrated into a person's sense of identity and future direction. Decisions made within that framework often feel less like risk and more like fulfillment of something already established. The move from Canada to England represented a turning point that was both geographical and emotional. It marked the transition from imagined proximity to physical reality, from distance-based connection to shared daily life. This transition is often where relationships reveal complexities that were previously hidden by separation. Living together removes the buffer of distance and introduces continuous interaction, where emotional responses are no longer delayed or softened but immediate and unfiltered. In such environments, small tensions can accumulate more quickly, and emotional regulation becomes more critical to maintaining stability. What unfolded inside the apartment in Chelmsford was not the result of a single moment in isolation, but the culmination of a process that developed within that shared space. The details of the final incident are documented in forensic and legal records, but beyond those facts lies a broader pattern of relational strain, emotional volatility, and escalating conflict. These patterns are often difficult to recognize in real time, especially for individuals who are emotionally invested in the relationship and do not yet have external distance from it. One of the most difficult aspects of domestic tragedy is that it often occurs within environments that appear ordinary from the outside. There is no external architecture that signals what is happening inside. Life in the surrounding area continues without interruption, while within a single household, conditions may be deteriorating in ways that are not fully visible to others. This separation between external normality and internal crisis is one of the reasons such cases are so difficult to predict and prevent. Ashley's story also reflects the broader realities of emotional isolation that can occur when a person moves away from their home country for a relationship. Physical distance from family and established support networks can increase emotional reliance on a partner, especially in the early stages of relocation. While this is not inherently problematic, it becomes significant in situations where the relationship itself is unstable. Without nearby support systems, the ability to process conflict, seek advice, or gain perspective becomes more limited, and emotional experiences are often contained within the relationship itself. In reflecting on the outcome of this case, it is important to acknowledge that justice, while necessary, is not the same as healing. The legal process can determine responsibility and impose consequences, but it cannot restore what has been lost or reverse the permanence of absence. For Ashley's family, the outcome of the trial represents accountability within the justice system, but it does not alter the lived reality of grief. That reality continues beyond courtrooms, beyond sentencing, and beyond public attention. At a societal level, cases like this often become points of reflection about relationships in the digital age. The ability to form deep emotional connections across distance is now a normal part of modern life, but it also introduces new forms of complexity. Emotional intimacy can develop without physical presence, and trust can be built through communication alone. While this can create meaningful relationships, it also means that the transition from online connection to real-world cohabitation carries emotional and psychological challenges that are not always fully anticipated. However, it is equally important not to reduce Ashley's story to a general warning or simplified lesson. She was not an abstraction or a case study. She was a person whose choices were shaped by trust, emotional sincerity, and belief in a shared future. Understanding her story requires holding both the reality of what happened and the humanity of who she was. To focus only on the outcome is to miss the life that existed before it. In the end, what remains is not resolution in the emotional sense, but remembrance. Remembrance of a life that moved across borders in pursuit of connection. Remembrance of the complexity of human relationships that can contain both hope and vulnerability. And remembrance of the fact that behind every case that enters the justice system, there is a story that began long before the moment it ended. The final reflection on this case is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is an acknowledgement that some stories do not close neatly because they are rooted in human experience rather than narrative design. Ashley Wadsworth's life, though cut short, remains part of a larger conversation about trust, distance, emotional dependence, and the fragile nature of safety within intimate relationships. And that conversation continues long after the courtroom has gone quiet. There is a point in every true crime story where the facts stop expanding and the meaning begins to settle in a different way, not as new information, but as lingering weight. After all the investigation, after the courtroom, after the official records have been written and sealed, what remains of Ashley Wadsworth's case is not movement or resolution, but stillness. A stillness that feels almost disproportionate to the speed at which everything unfolded in those final hours inside a small apartment in Chelmsford. It is the kind of stillness that forces reflection, not on the mechanics of what happened, but on the conditions that allowed a life filled with possibility to end in such irreversible collapse. Ashley's story does not begin with violence, and it does not belong solely to the moment it ended. It stretches backward into a life shaped by ordinary experiences, quiet personality, and emotional openness. She was someone who, like many young people, believed in the idea that connection could bridge distance. That time spent apart did not weaken emotional truth but instead strengthened it. That belief is not unusual, and it is not irrational within its own context. It is, in fact, one of the most human things imaginable, the willingness to trust in continuity, even when the world is physically separated by geography. What makes this case so difficult to process is the collision between that emotional logic and the reality of lived experience, once proximity replaced distance. In long-distance relationships, much of the emotional structure is built in absence. People present their best selves, their most intentional words, their carefully chosen expressions of care. When that structure transitions into shared living space, it is no longer sustained by selective interaction. It becomes continuous, unfiltered, and immediate. For some relationships, this transition strengthens bonds. For others, it exposes fractures that were previously invisible. Inside that apartment, those fractures were no longer theoretical. They became part of daily life, shaping tone, behavior, and emotional atmosphere. The progression from connection to conflict in domestic environments is rarely linear or easy to identify from the outside. It is often experienced as a series of emotional shifts that do not always announce themselves clearly. A conversation that feels normal one day may feel heavier the next. A disagreement that seems manageable at one point may become more significant over time. These accumulations matter because they define the emotional landscape long before any physical escalation occurs. Ashley's decision to leave Canada was rooted in belief, not in fear. That distinction is important because it frames her story not as one of recklessness, but as one of trust placed in a relationship that had existed for years across distance. When someone makes the decision to relocate internationally for love, they are not simply changing location. They are reorganizing their entire support structure, their daily environment, and their sense of stability. That kind of decision is rarely made lightly, and it reflects a level of emotional commitment that carries its own inherent vulnerability. Once she arrived in England, the relationship was no longer defined by anticipation but by reality. Reality has a way of removing ambiguity. It forces patterns to become visible, interactions to become consistent, and emotional responses to become immediate. In that environment, any instability within the relationship becomes harder to avoid or reframe. There is no distance to soften conflict, no delay to allow emotions to settle before the next interaction occurs. Everything is present, continuous, and unavoidable. The tragedy of Ashley Wadsworth's case lies not only in the violence that ultimately ended her life, but in the fact that the environment in which it occurred was one that had already become emotionally unstable before it reached its final point. By the time the incident unfolded, the conditions inside that space had already shifted away from the initial promise that brought her there. What remained was a compressed emotional environment where conflict and fear had begun to replace trust and expectation. When examining cases like this, it is tempting to search for a singular explanation, a defining moment, or a clear warning that could have changed the outcome. But domestic tragedies rarely offer that simplicity. They are built from accumulated experiences, emotional patterns, and interpersonal dynamics that develop over time. The absence of a single visible breaking point is part of what makes them so difficult to predict and prevent. Ashley's life, however, should not be defined solely through the lens of its ending. To do so would reduce her existence to a single moment, which would erase the years that came before it. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman navigating relationships and identity at a stage of life where emotional experiences often carry profound weight. Her choices were shaped by belief in connection, and that belief is something that remains recognizable to anyone who has ever trusted in the idea that distance does not diminish emotional truth. The aftermath of her death extends beyond legal judgment. It continues in the lives of her family, who must live with absence that cannot be reconciled with explanation. It continues in the broader conversations about relationships formed online, about emotional dependency, about the challenges of moving between countries for love. These conversations are not about assigning blame to technology or to distance itself, but about recognizing the complexity of human connection in a world where relationships are no longer limited by geography. There is also a quieter reflection that emerges from this case, one that is less about systems and more about fragility. The fragility of trust, the fragility of emotional certainty, and the fragility of the belief that love alone can stabilize a situation once it becomes physically shared. These are not flaws in individuals, but realities of human relationships that become more visible in extreme outcomes. As this narrative reaches its final stage, there is no new evidence to uncover, no additional revelation that changes the known outcome. What remains is the responsibility to remember the full scope of what this case represents. Not just the legal facts, not just the timeline of events, but the human story that existed before and beyond them. A story that began with connection across distance, moved through hope and transition, and ended in irreversible loss. In the silence that follows, the most important thing left is not explanation, but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that behind every case file is a life that once existed in full complexity, and that the weight of its ending does not erase the meaning of everything that came before it. When a case reaches its final stage in public memory, what often remains is not the sequence of events itself, but the questions that continue to echo long after the official narrative has closed. In the case of Ashley Wadsworth, those questions do not revolve around a lack of information, because the investigation, the forensic work, and the court proceedings have already established a clear factual framework. Instead, the lingering questions exist in the emotional and human space that law cannot fully occupy, the space where understanding and explanation are not the same thing. There is a natural human desire to search for turning points in stories like this, moments where everything could have changed, where a different decision might have altered the outcome. But domestic tragedies rarely present themselves in such clean divisions. They unfold in gradual shifts, in patterns of interaction that evolve over time without a single visible rupture. This is why they are so difficult to interrupt. From the outside, there is rarely a moment that clearly announces danger in advance. From the inside, emotional experience is often too complex, too intertwined with hope and history, to allow for immediate separation between discomfort and definitive recognition of risk. Ashley's case sits within that difficult space. Her journey was not defined by a sudden departure from safety into danger, but by a transition between emotional environments that only reveal their full complexity once proximity replaced distance. The relationship that had once existed through communication alone had already formed its emotional foundation before physical life together began. That foundation, built over years, carried with it a sense of stability that made the eventual transition feel natural rather than uncertain. This is an important aspect to understand because it explains why decisions that appear risky in hindsight often feel reasonable at the time they are made. Once she moved to England, the structure of the relationship changed in ways that cannot be fully replicated through digital communication. Physical presence removes distance as a buffer. Every interaction becomes immediate. Every emotional response becomes part of shared space, and there is no separation that allows time for reflection before the next exchange occurs. In such conditions, emotional dynamics become continuous rather than episodic, which can intensify both positive and negative experiences within the relationship. The environment inside the apartment in Chelmsford was not inherently defined by violence from the beginning. It became shaped over time by interaction, reaction, and accumulation. These are the elements that often define domestic environments under strain. Not a single defining incident, but a gradual layering of emotional responses that build upon one another until the overall atmosphere changes in character. This kind of progression is subtle in real time, but much more visible in hindsight once the outcome is known. What complicates understanding even further is the role of emotional perception within relationships. Each individual experiences the same environment differently, filtered through personal expectations, emotional needs, and psychological state. What may feel like tension to one person may feel like conflict resolution to another. What may feel like instability internally may not be fully expressed externally. This gap between internal experience and external perception is one of the reasons why domestic situations can remain hidden from broader awareness until they reach critical points. In reflecting on Ashley's life, it is essential not to allow the final chapter to overwrite everything that came before it. She was not defined solely by the circumstances of her death. She was defined by the choices she made, the relationships she formed, and the belief she held in the possibility of shared future. Those elements are part of a broader human story that existed independently of its tragic conclusion. To reduce her existence to a single outcome would be to lose sight of the full reality of who she was. At the same time, the responsibility of examining cases like this lies in recognizing patterns that extend beyond any one individual story. Domestic violence does not exist in isolation. It is part of a broader social and relational framework that includes emotional dependency, isolation, communication breakdown, and the challenges of navigating relationships across distance and cultural transition. These factors do not excuse actions, but they help explain the environments in which such tragedies can occur. There is also a broader reflection on how modern relationships are formed and maintained. In an era where communication can sustain emotional closeness across continents, the boundary between online connection and physical relationship has become increasingly fluid. This fluidity creates opportunities for meaningful connection, but it also introduces complexities that are not always immediately visible. The transition from digital intimacy to shared physical life requires adjustment that is often underestimated in its emotional impact. Ashley's story, when viewed in its entirety, is not simply about an endpoint. It is about the trajectory of a life that moved through trust, connection, transition, and ultimately irreversible loss. It is about the intersection of human emotion and real-world conditions, and the ways in which those intersections can sometimes produce outcomes that no one involved fully anticipates or intends. As the narrative reaches its final reflection, what remains is not a solution or a final explanation, but a recognition of complexity. The legal system can define responsibility, the investigation can reconstruct events, and public discussion can explore meaning, but none of these elements can fully contain the lived reality of what occurred. They can only approach it from different directions. The lasting significance of this case lies in its reminder of how fragile human connection can become when placed under conditions of isolation, emotional intensity, and transition. It is a reminder that relationships exist not only in moments of closeness, but in the environments in which that closeness is sustained. And when those environments change, everything within them can change as well. In the end, what remains is memory, not closure. A memory of a young woman whose life crossed borders in pursuit of connection, and whose story now exists as part of a larger human conversation about trust, vulnerability, and the unpredictable nature of emotional reality.